Okay. Welcome everybody to the last session on Agile. Before we start working on how we'll apply it, will we apply it, how we'll apply it here in enterprise applications. So this is essentially a summary leading into hopefully some discussion, initial discussion about how we might want to move forward. So remember, what is Agile? There's the Agile Manifesto. So key things being individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration as a major element, right, of what we need to incorporate into the processes, and responding to change over following the plan. So that's one of the major changes, major adjustments, if you will, in attitude. Historically, we view change after we started as a bad thing. When we're doing Agile, we need to view change to some extent as a good thing because we are learning things as we go along and producing a better product. Benefits of Agile. So we have the 4: visibility, adaptability, business value, and risk. So what is it about Agile that increases visibility?
You're working together with the customer pretty much from the start continuously.
Right. In Scrum, we do it with what? Pardon?
So every day, we meet every day.
But not with the customer.
Right.
So we have a 2 weeks, make this up, 2 week sprint.
Right.
At the end of the sprint, what do? We do about 3 things.
Demo.
That's right. We do a demo to the customer. This is what we've accomplished in this sprint. Okay. Kanban's a little bit different, right? And yes, Don's right. We do regular interactions. Customers are involved in prioritizing the queue and seeing what gets fed in. So that's a major element of it also. But in terms of producing output, for Scrum, it's that demo. For Kanban, they don't necessarily do a demo, right? So what gives the customer some confidence and visibility? We still do regular releases. So it's not going to be as rapid and as frequent as a Scrum cycle, but we do that. And there's another element that we very briefly touched on when we talked about Kanban, which is basically the regular operations reviews with the customer, where they get to see what we've been doing, what are our metrics, things like that. Adaptability. This is the gimme. What is it that makes Agile so much more adaptable than our traditional methods? And this is pretty much the same for Scrum and Kanban.
Not tied in with the spec.
Change is fine.
Yeah.
Change is fine. We constantly are accepting changes into the queue, right? And yes, you can and do expect changes as you go along, and you get, especially the customer gets a better view, or the customer's representative, of what's coming out in the way of a product. What inverts the risk curve?
I think isn't it the fact that you orientate so tightly, right? And shorter development cycles. So instead of finding out at the end you have a problem, you're going to find out in Scrum within a 2-week period. And within Kanban, maybe not 2 weeks, but
Some
not a
regular
year and a
cycle.
half.
Exactly. So that reduces the risks because what's one of the biggest risks in any project?
Not knowing the end product till
Well,
it's
it's
too late.
always the misinterpretation of requirements, right?
Exactly.
That's why they're
Communications.
both high at the start, because that's always a problem at the start. But you quickly resolve that with Scrum/Kanban. You get to the place where it's known and it's obvious.
Biggest problem is even a big project, right? They write the spec, spend months writing the spec, can still be interpreted,
Right.
misinterpreted, and it can just flat out be wrong once you get going.
There's no substitute for actually testing the assumptions in the spec with the real product.
So then we also talked about the business value curve. But what's required for us to accomplish that? That may or may not happen in what we do.
Interaction, right? The interaction and
Well,
their involvement.
when do you get business value?
You're putting things into production.
Yeah.
Steadily.
Exactly. So you have to be doing that to get that business value curve. And you may or may not actually be able to do that, depending upon what it is you're developing, right? So that's one that you have to look at and say, well, can I incrementally deliver whatever it is I'm working on? Or is it, in fact, that's incrementally showing people that we're making progress, but I don't really get the value until I can deploy it. So this talks about the Agile implementation team, right? Customer, people working with the customer. What's the difference? This is a Scrum team. What's the difference in a Kanban team? And it's a nuance. Somebody? In a Kanban team, in a Scrum team, you are working on what? A single project, right? In Kanban, what are you doing? Potentially.
On multiple projects at the same time.
On multiple projects on the same time. So, customers, not one customer. User stories. Spent some time on that. And user stories are a major element of Scrum. Are they used in Kanban? Yeah, are they used in Kanban?
I mean, the user story,
Hmm?
how could you tell? Would you need the user story either way?
User story was from a Scrum standpoint was for a project or product, right? So for sure, if we're doing one of the things in our list is a project, then we still will have user stories. Okay. But we have other things that come in, defects, things like that. We could say we're going to represent a lot of those as basically a user story if we wanted to. We didn't say that we would do that per se because we probably have a remedy ticket or something that we're working off of, right? But you could actually broaden the application of user stories and get a little more consistency in your estimation that way. Here's the infamous Scrum framework, right? you have the work backlog. And the thing about Scrum is it always comes from one set of requirements breaking down to the high-level design, right? Fills this. There's sprint planning that goes on at the beginning of each sprint, right? It says, okay, what user stories are we putting in the input queue? And then we go through this, I'll say 2-week cycle, whatever it is. We execute daily. We have our daily stand-up meeting every day, right? About halfway through the period, we take a look at the backlog and do some grooming of the backlog, right? And then when we're done, there's the demo, right? We review how the whole thing went, identify what we think we might have done better, where were the problems, and then spend time in what they call the retrospective. But what are we going to do to improve it for the next cycle? What's an epic?
It's a collection of stories. Repeat, right?
Right. It's basically a higher level element of requirements, if you will, that needs to be broken down into more user stories before you actually get into the implementation. Okay? We do estimation rapidly, right? In the case of, and this is primarily a Scrum story, right? For the first couple passes through as you're learning as a team, you will probably use some typical estimation techniques that we would use today to kind of roughly size effort for each of the stories, right? But we rather quickly evolve to story points. We kind of scale and start using the concept of story points. And then estimates are relative based on our judgment. But we don't spend a lot of time on it, right? You're filling the queue based on what your rough estimate is till you think you have filled the queue to the capacity of the team, right? So again, these are Scrum metrics. Velocity is the number of story points you can deliver within a cycle, assuming the same team and the same availability of the team members. Capacity is velocity adjusted for the variations. So in this sprint, we had this team, which is our whole team, everybody's there. In this sprint, somebody's on vacation for half the sprint, so our capacity goes down, it has to be adjusted. And then there's the typical Scrum metrics. Most common are burn down chart, which is within a sprint, tracking how many story points are we getting out each day, completing each day. The goal being that at the end of the 2-week sprint, you've completed them all. Now, we've talked about a number of things that would be variants around this, including how are we going to work with change management team, and do we expect basically to have work that then flows over to the next cycle? And those are all things we're going to have to figure out how we want to effectively manage when we go forward. Then within a release, you have I don't know why they called it burn up. I've never seen anything burn up. Well, yeah, I guess I have. It was a big building that burned up, wasn't there? But actually burned down. Oh, well, yeah. And this, again, is showing the progress over the sprints towards the release. And kind of a varying range, max, min expectation based on your history. Any questions so far? Specifically, any questions about Scrum? Okay. So here's the framework for Kanban. A lot of this stuff some of the stuff up front is the same. If you're doing a project, you still have this stuff feeding the backlog, but you can be introducing other elements into the work stream. So it's not all dedicated to one project. And that's one of the biggest changes and most important from the standpoint of our ability to adopt Agile. So we have the work backlog. The work queue is reviewed periodically by the business owners and the project manager, and the work queue is continually added to, because as opposed to sprints, which are 2-week, 4-week, 6-week fixed cycles, Kanban is what?
Well, it can vary.
Pardon?
It can vary, right? You're setting it.
It's continuous, right? It's a continuous process. So you get the work, keep the work queue adequately filled. What's the key enabler? What's the single most important key enabler for Kanban to be successful? I know it's been too long. Limiting work in process. That's the key enabler, okay? That's why there's this work in process control concept in there, right? You still have the daily stand-up meeting. You break out issues for resolution if they can't be resolved right away in the meeting. You take completed work and it goes into the release planning process. And releases then are planned based on what's expected to be done and what time frame. And of course, there has to be some flexibility about that, because just like Scrum, requirements can change. And our priorities can change somewhat. If, for example, in a Kanban, well, I'll hold that. I'll do that next. Characteristics of Kanban. You start, try to make it minimally disruptive when you start. So if you have a kind of typical waterfall kind of development process, which we sort of have here, although they tend to be relatively short waterfalls depending upon the project, you still sort of stay with that concept, and what you introduce, the framework, if you will, but not necessarily changing the sequence of things you do. Continuous delivery model, we talked about that. What do we mean by a pull model?
As and when you have the bandwidth, you pull something from the
Exactly. And who does that?
team.
The team, yes. So, or a member of the team. Wow, okay, I'm done with this. That's the last item I've got. I can reach out and probably confer with your project manager or other team members and pull the next piece of work in. It's not pushed in, you're pulled in so that you are maintaining with little variance the work in process restraint. We maintain a regular release cadence. Key things, multiple sources and types of work items. So we get to allocate capacity. Ultimately, when you're more mature in the process, you can start thinking about having service level objectives, or they'll say service level agreements, but normally they're really just objectives that you've agreed to. And the recipe for success, remember we spent some time on this, right? A focus on quality, work in process, reduce and manage the work in process. Deliver often, that's back to the regular release cadence. Balance demand against throughput, again. Work in process is constrained, so you have to balance what your priorities are on the front end based on what is the real capacity of your team. And that comes down to the prioritization and then the continuous improvement process, which is attack the sources of variability so that you can increase your productivity and gradually, therefore, increase the number of work items that get through in a given time. We have a card wall in Scrum, don't we? Right? You're starting to do it as hopefully as a physical board, and you basically have, here's the stuff that has to come in for this particular sprint, and it can be very simple. It's in process, it's done, right? Well, we have a card wall for Kanban too. But how is this card wall different than a typical Scrum card?
You wouldn't have like 3 items because these are different projects, same resources. You would have a conflict. But in Scrum, it is one project and something.
That's true, and we'll have a view that shows that. But just the design of this wall, there's a whole lot more columns here than there are in what we looked at in Scrum, aren't there? And in fact, we tend to have columns that align with our process. But what do we have in between? Buffers. So in the Kanban wall, you put in buffers. The reason for that is what?
Because of the pull?
Pardon?
Because of the pull?
No.
We're trying to avoid bottlenecks at all.
Trying to avoid bottlenecks. You're trying to identify bottlenecks, identify blockages, and they basically usually show up in the buffer. So it both smooths the process through, because you can take this, move it over, it's in the buffer, waiting, you take the next one in, right? But it's an important thing for visibility into how effectively we are operating. So yes, we have a card wall. There's more elements to it, and we look for it to give us more information than you might in a Scrum card wall.
Question. How, since you're not defining all requirements and the full scope up front, how do you prevent, I mean, there's no such thing as scope creep if you don't have it locked down up front, but how do you not get
If you're
say,
doing
something that's relatively,
if you're doing a project, you still do have a requirements document
Yeah, with estimates, right?
with some estimates. You have a high-level design. You've defined your stories and epics. So you do have requirements. They're not going to be as detailed as we might want them to be, right? But we still do have a line around the scope for a project or product, okay? Now, when they start changing at this level, you could probably start thinking about, now this is looking like scope creep, right? As opposed to, I'm down in here and we're refining, we're changing some of the details in here, and that the story's at epics level because we've gained an increased understanding of what it really means to deliver this. Fair enough? We do prioritize, but we do it on demand, right? There's a periodic review by, again, the customers and perhaps the project manager and perhaps development manager, if there was a test manager. And the customers go, what's the highest priority thing for us to do next? We prioritize it then. Whereas most often today, priorities get set when? We change them, of course. Let's just say. The beginning, right? You started this project, it's got this priority. Started anything, it's got this priority. Well, here, the customers get to collaborate, knowing that the presumption that they all have the best interests of the university in mind. They prioritize the work as it's getting ready to happen based on that thought process. Where are we right now? And what's most important for us to do now? We talked about classes of service. Expedite, which generally we talk about. Expedite is probably what in our current word? Critical ticket, right. Fixed delivery date. That's a project that probably has a university mandated completion date, a statutory completion date, the GA mandated completion date, right? And then there's sort of the standard, which is most everything else. And then there's the as availables, i.e. we want to get it done at some point, but there isn't a fixed time we have to have it done. Work on it as you can. We have these in Kanban, we don't have them in Scrum. Why wouldn't we have them in Scrum?
the only thing you're working on.
Exactly. We're only working on one thing. And then we talked about capacity allocation. presentation, right? That's where I think you were going, right? So you can say, okay, I'm going to have more than one type of work coming at me as a team, and we might want to set some parameters around how we should allocate our capacity based on our experience. And you would over time perhaps adjust that, right? So in this example, I put the percentages shown there. One of the things we'll need to do if we're planning to go forward, as a team, is kind of think about what actually are going to be the classes. Are these the ones? And if they are, what do we roughly think we ought to set the capacity at? Kanban has a slightly different set of metrics. Cycle time, the time that elapses from the moment the team starts working on a task until they're done. That kind of is parallel to velocity, where velocity is multiples, right? But it's how long does it take you to get done? Then there's the dreaded customer lead time, which says I put it in the backlog, and then on average, and with what distribution around that average, is our actual lead time to get the work done. Throughput is kind of a growing thing that says this is what we've completed over time. And of course, work in process, tracking the work in process on a very regular basis, daily to start, right? How much work do we have in process, and kind of map it and see how well we are staying around the work in process boundary that we set for ourselves. Any questions on this? Okay. That's the introduction to Agile. You all are graduates. The people who never showed up in the room, you can say, yeah, I'm a graduate. I am now an EA Agile professional.
We're going to hear please.
That's right, they get an incomplete. You can. Thank you guys so much for your attention.
Thank you, Bob. Very good.